High on a windswept plain in the Andes, almost 2.5 miles above the sea, lie some of the strangest stones on Earth. Their faces are flat as glass. Their angles are impossibly sharp, and nobody can fully agree on how they were made. This is Puma Punku, in the highlands of modern Bolivia. To the eye it looks less like the work of ancient hands and more like the wreckage of some vast machine, torn apart and abandoned. For more than a century it has been a magnet for the curious, the obsessed, and the fringe. Some look at these stones and see a lost supertechnology. Others see something even more remarkable, what human beings can do with patience alone. To understand the mystery, you first have to understand where you are standing. This is the Altiplano, a high plateau near the border of Bolivia and Peru, close to the shore of Lake Titicaca. It is a brutal place to build anything. The air holds barely half the oxygen of the coast. Nights freeze even in summer. Trees are almost non-existent. And yet here, over 1,000 years ago, a great city rose. That city was Tiwanaku. At its height it may have held tens of thousands of people, with pyramids, temples, canals and courtyards, ruled by an elite who commanded labor across the whole region. Puma Punku was one of its temple complexes, a raised platform mound faced in stone, approached by broad stairways. Its name, in the local Aymara language, means the Gate of the Puma. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, the city was already a ruin, already ancient, already a mystery. They asked the local people who had built it. The answer they received was startling. The locals told them they did not know. It had not been built by their ancestors, they said. It had always been there. Some said it had been raised in a single night, at the dawn of the world, by a race of giants. A Spanish chronicler named Pedro Cieza de Leon walked the site and wrote it down. He described stones so huge and so finely joined that he could not imagine what tools, or what people, had shaped them. So what exactly did he see? What is it about these particular stones that has fascinated and unsettled people for 500 years? To answer that, we have to look closely, very closely. The most famous stones at Puma Punku are the H blocks. Dozens of grey andesite blocks, each cut into the same complex shape, like a letter H standing upright, with matching notches, ledges and channels. They are so consistent that if you photographed one and laid the picture over another, the outlines would very nearly match. What stuns people is how alike they are. Line them up and their inner angles, their steps, their grooves repeat again and again, as if each was pressed from the same mold. The surfaces are not just smooth. They are flat to a degree you can feel with your hand. Long faces meet in interior corners so crisp they look cut by a blade, not chipped by a hammer. Then there are the drill marks. Rows of small round holes, evenly spaced, running in perfect lines along the edges of some blocks, as if a machine had walked down the stone. And the grooves. Narrow channels cut into the stone with parallel walls of even width, some with tiny notches spaced along them, precise enough to make an engineer stop and stare. Put it all together, flat planes, sharp inner corners, repeated modules, drilled lines, and you begin to see why people struggle. Because this does not look like what we expect from the ancient world. And these are not small stones. The largest slab at Puma Punku weighs an estimated 130 tons. A second giant weighs about 85. These are single pieces of stone, quarried, moved, and shaped by hand. The nearest quarry for the red sandstone lies about 10 kilometers away. The finer grey andesite came from even farther, dozens of kilometers, possibly hauled along the lake shore. Remember the setting. No horses, no oxen, no iron tools, and, as far as we know, no wheels used for transport. Just human muscle, rope, stone, and time, at an altitude where every step leaves you breathless. At nearly 4,000 meters, even trained soldiers move slowly and tire fast. Now imagine dragging a slab heavier than 20 elephants across that ground. So the puzzle sharpens. How did a people with no iron and no writing move 100-ton blocks across mountains, and then carve them with such uncanny precision? It is exactly this gap, between what we see and what we think ancient people could do, that opened the door to the wilder theories. And they arrived quickly. By the 20th century, Puma Punku had become a favorite exhibit for those who argue that ancient monuments were not built by ancient humans at all. One popular claim is that the stones are simply too perfect. That flat faces and sharp interior angles in hard andesite require power tools, diamond saws, machine drills, technology no ancient culture possessed. Another claim leans on the setting itself. How, people ask, Could a Stone Age society in one of the harshest places on Earth organize labor on this scale without collapsing? And then there is the boldest claim of all, that Puma Punku is not 1,000 years old, but tens of thousands. That it predates every known civilization, a relic of a lost golden age wiped away by catastrophe. This idea has a specific source. In the early 1900s, a scholar named Arthur Poznański spent decades studying Tiwanaku, and became convinced it was staggeringly old. Poznański tried to date the site by the stars. He measured how certain walls and gateways seemed to line up with the sunrise, and reasoned that because the Earth slowly tilts over thousands of years, the alignment could act like a clock. Run the clock backwards, he argued, and you find the year it was built. His math gave a shocking answer: 17,000 years. 17,000 years would rewrite everything. So the real question becomes simple. Who actually built Puma Punku, and when? To answer that, archaeologists did not look to the stars. They looked in the ground. And under the ground at Tiwanaku is one of the richest records in the ancient Americas. Layer by layer they found pottery, tools, food remains, house floors, and burials. And crucially, they found organic material, charcoal, bone, plant remains that can be dated by the decay of radioactive carbon. The results were consistent, and they came from many different samples across many years of digging. The great building phase of Tiwanaku, including Puma Punku, falls roughly between 500 and 1,000 years after Christ. Not 17,000 years ago. About 1,500. A real span, by real people, recorded in the soil itself. Poznański's star dating failed because it rested on a guess that the site was built to mark a specific tilt of the Earth. Change that assumption, and the astronomical date collapses. The radiocarbon dates, from the ground, held firm. So the builders were the Tiwanaku, a real, sophisticated Andean civilization. Far from primitive, they were master engineers of one of the most difficult environments on the planet. They fed a city on the frozen plateau by inventing raised planting beds, long mounds of soil separated by water channels that stored the sun's heat and shielded crops from the killing night frost. They built a sunken temple lined with stone heads, a terraced pyramid called the Akapana, and the famous Gateway of the Sun, carved from a single block, its lintel crowded with a staff-bearing god. These were not people who stumbled onto a ruined machine. These were people who understood stone as deeply as any culture in history. So how did they achieve that machine-like precision, without machines? The answer is a combination of clever methods, endless patience, and skills we have partly forgotten. Start with the flat faces. The builders did not saw the stone. They pounded it. Using hammerstones of even harder rock, a mason could bruise and flake a surface down, grain by grain, then grind it smooth with sand and water until it shone. It is agonizingly slow, but it works, and it explains the flatness. A patient craftsman with a straight edge and abrasive can produce a surface as true as any modern tool, given enough hours. But what about the repeated shapes, the near-identical H-blocks that look mass-produced? Here the Tiwanaku did something genuinely clever, something that feels almost modern. They used templates. By carving a master pattern of wood, bone, or stone, and copying it onto block after block, they could reproduce the same complex shape dozens of times. It is prefabrication, ancient style, standard parts, made to fit together. And that is the real purpose of those strange notches and ledges. The H-blocks were not sculpture. They were building components, designed to lock together into walls and gateways, like the ancient world's most patient stonework puzzle. The precise grooves guided smaller stones or facing panels into place. The flat faces let block sit flush against block, with no gaps. Every feature that looks like decoration was, in fact, engineering. The drilled rows of holes had a job too. Some helped split raw stone, drill a line of holes, drive in wedges, and the block cleaves along the line. Others anchored the stones to one another. Because the builders had one more trick, and it is the most striking of all. In carved recesses between certain blocks, they poured molten metal. They cut matching eye-shaped slots across the joint between two stones, then poured in liquid copper alloy on the spot. When it cooled, it froze into a metal clamp, stitching the blocks together against the shaking earth. To do this they had to smelt metal to over 1,000 degrees, at altitude, and carry it glowing to the wall, a feat of skill in its own right. This was confirmed by modern analysis. The metal was cast in place, not hammered in later. It is a technique of real sophistication, and it points to why so much of this was done. One word: earthquakes. The Andes are seismically violent. A rigid stone wall would crack and topple. But a wall of interlocking blocks, stitched with metal clamps and fitted without mortar, can flex, shift, and settle without falling apart. So the very features that make Puma Punku look like machine work, the interlocks, the clamps, the precision, are not evidence of lost technology. They are evidence of brilliant earthquake engineering, worked out over generations. The Tiwanaku were not copying aliens. They were solving a hard problem, in a hard place, with the materials they had, and they solved it better than almost anyone in the ancient world. Which raises the last question. If they were so skilled, and their city so grand, what happened? Why is Puma Punku a shattered field of stone, and not a standing temple? Part of the answer is nature. Around 1,000 years after Christ, the climate on the Altiplano turned against the Tiwanaku. A long drought settled over the highlands. The rains failed. The raised fields that fed the city began to dry out. Without reliable harvests, the whole system that supported a great city, the labor, the elite, the temples, could no longer hold together. Over generations, Tiwanaku emptied. The people dispersed into smaller farming communities. By the time the Inca rose to power centuries later, Tiwanaku was already a legend. The Inca revered it, and wove it into their own myth of creation, the place where their creator God made the first people. But nature only started the destruction. The rest was human. Once the temples fell silent, Puma Punku became a quarry. For centuries, its beautifully cut blocks were too tempting to leave alone. Later peoples, colonial builders, and settlers carried off the finished stones for churches, houses, bridges and walls. In the 19th century a railway was driven across the region, and Puma Punku stones were reportedly broken up and used for ballast beneath the tracks and for new construction. A monument that had stood for 1,000 years was fed, piece by piece, into someone else's project. The site was mined for its own bones. Treasure hunters made it worse. Convinced that gold lay hidden beneath the platforms, they dug, pried, and even dynamited the structures, toppling walls and cracking the great slabs apart. So the chaos we see today, the tumbled blocks, the scattered H-stones, the shattered giants, is not how Puma Punku was left by its builders. It is the wreckage of 1,000 years of drought, looting, and demolition. And that changes how we should look at it. When you clear away the myths, the aliens, the lost supertechnology, the 17,000 years, what remains is not less impressive. It is more. A people with no iron, no wheels for hauling, and no written language mastered the hardest stone, in the thinnest air, on one of the highest inhabited plateaus on Earth, and made it fit together like a puzzle built to survive earthquakes. They planned it, standardized it, and executed it across generations, the way only a truly organized society can. They did it with hammerstones and sand, with templates and molten copper, with organization and knowledge passed down through generations of masons who never signed their names. The temptation to credit their work to gods or aliens is an old one, and it is worth naming honestly. It usually says less about the ancient world than about how little we expect of it. Every time we assume ancient people could not have built something, and go looking for a secret shortcut, we quietly erase the real achievement, and the real people who made it. Puma Punku is not the wreck of a machine. It is a monument to what human hands and human minds can accomplish, given a reason, a method, and enough patient years. The stones are still there, on that cold high plain, flat faces catching the Andean sun exactly as they did more than 1,000 years ago, waiting for us to see them clearly. Not a mystery to be solved by aliens, but a message from our own ancestors, carved in the hardest stone they could find. We were here. We were capable. And we built to last.